Hey, David. How are you?
Hi. This is David Roberts. I'm the lead writer at Grist.org, and I'm talking today with Andy Revkin of the New York Times and Pace University. Now you can get more clarity on your position when you introduce yourself. I know you have a long position title. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the tsunami that just took place last night in Japan, and sort of the implications for how we think about risk and risk management, and how we talk about science and scientific risks, and then segueing into how we talk about climate risks and how we address those, if we do address them at all, which is an open question. So, Andy, tell us, give us your job description, and then tell us what you think about this tsunami. What is this? What's the lesson?
Yeah, well, I write the .earth blog for the New York Times, which is a blog about how do we smooth the human journey in a time of unprecedented, when we're in the middle of a big growth spurt, both in our numbers and our impacts on the world, and many other things are cresting at the same time, just our demands for resources. And one thing I write about a lot is this kind of risk, as well as climate and other things, loss of biodiversity. The risks in an urban world heading toward 9 billion people, many of whom are liking to live in cities, many around the world are living in seismically active zones, big-time earthquake risk everywhere you can imagine. New Delhi, Kathmandu, Istanbul, as I wrote extensively, and of course Japan. Now Japan, what's really interesting about today's event is, I guess there's three things Japan has going for it. Even though there will be horrible death toll there already, you can see in the coast. It's a country that has wealth, technology, and enough earthquake activity that it's serious about getting ready. And if you've seen the YouTube video of the swaying buildings in downtown Tokyo, they look utterly scary, but they're designed to sway. They're heavily invested in making sure as much of their infrastructure as possible can withstand this kind of shock. So they have three things, and there are other places, even some rich places, like kind of where you live, David, that face the similar tectonic threat. In the Northwest, it's the Cascadia Fault, but that are way behind in terms of taking seriously the need to retrofit schools, among other things, which I wrote about a lot after the Sichuan quake in China. And the Chile quake last year, each time that happens, it should hopefully be sending a signal to Oregon and the rest of the Northwest. Hey, you guys have 1,000 schools that people know how to fix up that are not able to withstand the earthquake that's coming. So why aren't you acting on that?
Well, this is in Seattle, we have an elevated highway. You've probably heard about the elevated highway 99 that comes into the city, is literally falling apart because of, in the last earthquake, sent huge chunks of it falling off. And it's basically accepted at this point that the next earthquake is going to send this elevated highway crashing to the ground. And, hundreds, thousands of people drive on it every day. And it's been that way for years now. We can't even manage to replace one highway, much less retrofit the entire city.
Well, this gets at this. We have a trait in humanity, especially with low-frequency things that have big bad outcomes, to put off investment until the bad stuff happens, and then people look around and go, "What the hell happened? How dare those politicians not act?" And climate is kind of the ultimate super slow-mo version of this. It has other issues going against it as well, And I've written several times about, in fact, just the day before the big quake in Japan, I did this piece where I kind of said, if we can't get earthquakes right, then how do we expect to get climate right, where it's got even more issues attending having an effective response?
Well, this is let's talk then about knowing that human beings have this tendency to discount long time scale and low and slow moving risks, which of course climate is the iconic case. How do we as journalists and as citizens address this? How do we try to overcome this tendency in human beings? One way to do it is you can do what Grist did this morning, which is publish a splashy, salacious piece on its front page saying, "Hey world, look at this earthquake. This is the kind of thing that's going to happen more, as climate change progresses. There's actually, it's just a scientific conference on this a couple of years ago, where scientists were saying as massive ice sheets shift, as sea levels rise, this is going to cause small but significant shifts in the mass of the Earth, and this is going to grind seismic. It's going to create more seismic activity and create more. And they say that a gigantic glacier crashing into the ground is going to create a much worse tsunami actually than the underground activity. So this is, one way to do it is just to remind people over and over again, every time something like this happens, this is what's coming. This is what we can expect more of. Don't think this is an isolated case.
Yeah.
And this is what I think, Grist is trying to do. But of course, then when Grist does this, you and many other people follow on saying, now, that's, you're exaggerating, you're not putting the proper caveats and hedges in there. We only know this with 80% certainty, not the 100% certainty you're applying. So, obviously you disfavor the strategy of waving alarm flags along the way. So I guess I'd ask you, what do we do? What do we do to force people out of this kind of trance that they are typically in, not being aware of these long-term risks?
Well, from a lot of the sociological work I've looked at recently, the last few years, and psychological, but sociology is more important than psychology here because it's about communities, how we respond as cultures, and or not. And there's just there's just zero evidence that kind of thing. Not only, to my mind, it's not a useful approach, even setting aside the sociology, because the earthquake risks are there regardless. The kind of activity that might or might not be stimulated by the retreat of ice sheets in the far north, even in Alaska, is just pales beside the overall seismic risk that already exists in these places. So, and it's just worse than thinking about like the rain in Pakistan and the heat in Russia as the reason to act. It just takes it to that much further an extent away from what would, to my mind, actually logically lead from the risk to the response. Especially,
did you mention logic? Because I'm wondering how that.
Well, I don't know.
We're talking about sociology.
Yeah, I know. Well, the reality here is that even people. There's a really interesting book on global trends and prospects called "The Rational Optimist" by Matt Ridley, and it lays out in this sort of unbelievable detail how lives are getting longer and better, and we're getting less poor, and our innovative capacity will always keep up with these changes in our resource base and stuff. But the problem is he gets into the same kind of clucky approach to that rational body of evidence as rational pessimists do. And whether it's Joe Rome or someone else who's a rational, I think, or trying to say they're rational pessimist, they're all butting up against the reality that, and this came up a few years ago, that you're not going to get people you can't tell people to be worried, as Time Magazine tried to do in 2006, and have them respond. And there's this misperception, I think, of the risk literature by some who say, yeah, it's okay as long as the dire warning is paired with here's what you do. Mm-hmm. That would be fine if the things that are listed in the here's what you do column actually would avert the problem. And unfortunately, every time I've seen that approach in the kind of activist media, they're not actually accurately conveying what would have to be done to limit the risk from building greenhouse gases in a world heading toward 9 billion people wanting to live somewhat like us. So it's.
But see, I always when you lay out this line of reasoning, which I think is probably accurate, I'm just left with humans have this tendency to discount long-term risks. You can't, no matter how much you yell at them, force them to be cognizant of these long-term risks and to do the kind of often wrenching and expensive things that would be required to mitigate those long-term substantial risks. So I'm left throwing my hands up. What's your,
well, this came up.
If you're going to
there is a way forward
for waving red flags. What's the alternative?
No, the way forward is, and I'm not I'm not big on the just do things, what do they call the no regrets stuff. It has to go beyond no regrets stuff. This is, but I do think there is a course of action that can be sold and that can make a difference. And it involves some of the things I've been trying to write about for a long time. And it's not just R&D. I use that as when I talk about our unbelievable, utter disinvestment, bipartisan, international, asleep at the wheel disinvestment and basic inquiry in the last few decades. I try not to imply that that's the only thing that's needed, but it's certainly a key starting point. I think it is possible to get people to understand that the stuff that surrounds us that we take for granted now didn't just come from nowhere. It came from sustained investment in the things that drive innovation. Not just drive innovation, but the basic seeds that give innovators the material they need to come up with the great new idea. The great new applied idea. And we're not even doing that. And I know.
Agree.
Now, when you get to Washington,
we need long-term R&D, but what I don't see is that it is evidence for the proposition that message is getting any more traction than the long-term fear message. I mean, I constantly hear that it should, it ought to, it's post-partisan, it's bipartisan, but I don't. There's no evidence
I chided the post-partisan power folks in a post late last year too, saying that again, there's no evidence that they're going to get traction with the spending issues that are underway with the Tea Party sort of at the controls for the moment of the Republican Party. I do think there's potential between now and 2012. I mean, and all of this is still iffy because it depends on who the Republicans start to get traction with for a frontrunner. If it's still a Tea Party-ish extreme cut everything, look only backward kind of person, then that will cut against the idea that you can have some progress on these issues. If it, on the other hand, there is this, what I think is a pretty typical move toward the middle, especially aimed at independents and moderates, as you get closer to a presidential election, I think there's a potential for the pushback against this kind of stop everything, cut everything, drill only approach to issues like energy. But I don't know. No, I just don't. Again, I think it could go either way depending on events in the world the next year.
Well, let me run this by you because it's something I've been thinking about recently. I wrote a post on it a couple of weeks ago, but I have started to think that perhaps the road in to getting people to actually do something is not in the end going to be mitigation, which is turning off your lights in hopes that 50 years and thousands of miles away, some tiny increment of greenhouse gas will not trap some tiny increment of heat, but rather adaptation.
Yeah.
Since this sort of washes away this, I mean, you make a good point that whatever contribution climate change makes to earthquake activity, it's going to be a marginal contribution relative to existing earthquake risks, and that's true also, I think, of storm damage and everything else. Yep. I mean, obviously, what climate change's effect is to exacerbate all these risks on them, but it doesn't, create the risks out of nothing. But if you're talking about preparing for the effects of what's coming, that distinction no longer matters. If you want to prepare for an earthquake, it doesn't matter what caused the earthquake, you prepare. If you want to prepare for wider swings in temperature or wider swings in precipitation, or you want to prepare for floods, or you want to prepare for droughts, you sort of bypass this endless dispute about degrees of causation. And I also think that once people get engaged and say, okay, we know for whatever reason that that more of these things that are happening now are going to happen in the future, and they're probably going to be a little bit worse. Let's get prepared for them. I tend to think that a lot of the things that you would do to become more resilient and responsive and agile and able to cope with these extreme events lots of that activity would have the knock-on effect of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, I think you want to, for instance, sprawl. You look at what happened to Brisbane when it flooded, when people lost the ability to drive on Brisbane highways. The city was completely paralyzed. There's no alternate route of getting around. There's no way of walking around. So, I mean, I tend to think that a lot of the same things that would reduce greenhouse gases, which is density and all the things that come with it, would also increase resilience and also serve adaptation. So maybe adaptation is the route in. I wonder what you think about that.
I'm going to bring up a story that I know you didn't like. Back in 2006, I wrote this piece, Yelling Fire on a Hot Planet. And a chunk of that story said, I just pulled it up here. This was this Yale study that came out of that year after this big conference in Aspen of a lot of people who wanted to focus on global warming, including Al Gore went to. Among its recommendations, the Yale book suggests something radical. So this is 2006. Drop the reluctance to accept adaptation as a strategy. Adaptation to climate extremes has long been derided by many environmentalists as defeatism. But this book says adaptation may help people focus on the reality of what's coming, and that may motivate them to cut emissions to limit chances of bigger changes to come. So it was, this is a smart, I think, approach, getting people to concretely start to deal with the reality that climate is changing and that extremes of climate, whatever the cause, are something that can be very damaging, and particularly damaging in developing countries that don't have the wealth and technology we have. That getting busy on making us more resilient to those things not only limits the losses, it also gets people just more focused on the realities of what's going on. This came up to some extent in the National Academy of Sciences reports on America's climate choices as well. So I couldn't agree more.
And one element of that, just to bring up one element of that that's dear to my heart, is actually we were at this conference together, you and I, last week, and we saw a guy presenting about the military's efforts to lighten its boot print, as they put it,
right.
and their worries about the energy and climate related national security threats. And one of the biggest threats on their list is the brittleness and age of the U.S. grid. So if you shut down a few key transformers, you can bring the whole grid down. If you shut down a few key gigantic power plants, you can bring the whole grid down. The whole thing is very centralized and brittle. So, to me, this serves as an argument for distributed energy and a grid where sources are closer to loads, where you're creating energy closer to where you're using it and where you're creating energy at multiple small places. So if any one of them are taken out, the other ones are still up. I think there's a real resilience argument in favor of distributed energy, and there's also a climate argument for it. And there's also, I think, a social justice argument for it in development terms for developing countries. I think if you want development to take a just and democratic path, I think you should try to avoid centralizing political power, and you should avoid centralizing power. Yeah, I think those go hand in hand. So this is one way where I think the mitigation and adaptation arguments pretty neatly overlap, and the adaptation one is probably the psychological or sociologically stronger one.
Yeah, and by the way, getting back to the broader question of how, given human fallibility, how you kind of move forward, I do still circle back quite often to Steve Schneider's admonition to kind of sequence things correctly, get some demonstrations started first before he in 2007 spoke and wrote. This is Stephen Schneider from Stanford, who passed away this past year. He wrote and spoke about the need to build public enthusiasm for the energy transformation first before you kind of get to the heavier lifting of starting to talk about imposing a cost on existing energy choices. This was before the cap and trade bill collapsed and died. And I think it was a reasonable approach. There was, again, you know more about the Washington end of things. I don't mean Washington State. I mean the Beltway, even though neither of us live there than I do. But the idea that we were going to have a comprehensive cap and trade bill, that the environmental community got so, I don't know whether it was overconfident or just forgot how hard this was. I don't think this was all just a function of the economic implosion. I think it was to get a bill through that would have the rigor to actually have any influence on the climate system it just was never going to happen, because to have the price of carbon get high enough, even to have a track for it to get high enough, to start swaying companies with big investments.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't want to.
We don't have to really go back there, but
I don't want to relitigate those arguments, which I had dozens and dozens of times. Sure. I tend to think that it was, particularly from the pre-economic crash standpoint, much more possible than people. I mean, people now talk as though it was destined to fail, and I don't think it necessarily was. I think there are a lot of contingent things that happened that could have gone the other way. But regardless, I mean, obviously the federal option is foreclosed for the time being, and even outside of California, you're starting to see a lot of state governments pull back, as the Tea Party fans out into the states, and now you're hearing about Americans for Prosperity and these Tea Party groups, these Koch-funded Tea Party groups going out to state houses. We ran a story about this, or I think we're going to run a story about this in the next couple of days, going to state houses and just handing legislators sheafs of pre-written bills, pre-written legislation and pre-written declarations saying we want to reverse our renewable energy standards, we want to pull out of regional cap and trade systems, etc. So I do think that Schneider's strategy is sort of, whether it's your first choice or not, it has kind of become the only choice. So I'm sort of interested in things like the project they're doing that David Orr spoke about at the conference, like they're doing at Oberlin, which is they're trying to basically create an island, the city of Oberlin. It's a small town, but create an island where they're doing what they call full spectrum sustainability, where they're getting green power, they're making their buildings more energy efficient, they're building public transit. They're trying to show in a demonstration project, this is what it would look like if you did all the things we're talking about and wove them all together. And this is sort of what kind of a prosperous, low carbon place could look like. And I think I think just seeing something like that really happen and really succeed will do more to flip people's psychology about this than all the white papers and PDFs in the world. So
sure, and many universities particularly are poised to do that kind of thing, to be the kind of the seed or the organizing principle behind that kind of demonstration. The one thing that I do think is a vital component of that, and one reason I kind of put a big foot into academia, I forgot at the beginning to mention I'm at Pace University as a senior fellow for environmental understanding, whatever that is.
Senior understanding.
Yeah, senior, right. Well, for trying to figure out, I spent 25 years, almost 30 years writing about science related to these issues, and started to realize if I'm not understanding more about how people absorb it and either ignore or accept information, I'm really wasting my life.
Well, I wish more people would follow your lead and try to, I mean, there is, this is the thing, is I'm sure you're discovering and you're writing about now a lot, is there's actually quite a bit of, social science has been at it for a while. There's actually quite a bit of fairly decent knowledge about how people process information and about what influences their behavior. But journalists, and not just journalists, but I would say also all the sort of engineering and science types involved in clean energy, and the economists perhaps worst of all, as we discussed last week too, have just remained sort of determinedly ignorant of this stuff and just continue to pretend as though humans are these rational automata.
I know, and it is kind of mind-blowing to see the walls between the social and physical sciences, particularly. I was at the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science meeting on a session on climate communication, where the phrase denialist gets thrown around a lot, and I raised my hand and said, I'm a denialist. I said, I've been denying the reality of this science that this other science that for years has said 20 years of really good science writing is going to matter. That isn't going to matter.
Denialists?
Yeah, I was basically in denial. I lived with the expectation that the deficit model, if there's a gap out there in understanding, you fill it and people will change. That would do it. Yeah, and scientists are even more deeply locked into that as far as than journalists are. I think we're both living in this
sort of ironic. It's like the few constituencies who seem to get that, understand that social science on an instinctive level are marketers,
yes.
People who make TV ads, and in a lot of ways, I think maybe accidentally, I don't know if they understand it on an academic level, but it seems to me the conservative movement in this country is perfectly willing in ways that madden people like you and me who care about evidence and reason are perfectly willing to say one thing and then say something opposite the next week, or to say stuff that they know is perfectly false, or to just ignore facts altogether and just completely talk on this level of values and emotions. I think and in a way, it's incredibly politically effective. They're drawing people together on a visceral level that creates much more intensity than any amount of information does.
Well, this gets at another thing we were talking about, which is the need for accuracy versus impact, and how this relates to the shape of this challenge. The shape of this challenge is that stasis is really easy to maintain. We all really like fossil fuels. We may not admit it, but every day when we turn on the lights or get into a car, whether you're an uber greenie or not, you like fossil fuels, and getting us off of that habit is going to be really hard. And so those who are making the case for this big change, whether it's like me, pushing on the innovation front, saying, you may not realize it, but everything you're doing relies on technological innovation, and we're not really doing that. Or someone with a traditional environmental regulatory approach saying we really need to put a price on carbon, and this is why. It's implicit in us. It's that much harder for us if you misstate something or whatever. It's so easy for those seeking to sustain inaction to point to a little bit of that and say, aha, and then people just kind of say, oh, this is just one of those disputes, therefore I can go back to... You have stated that case on your blog, and you just stated it quite eloquently there, and I just don't... I want to push back against it, because sure.
I just don't think that's... I just don't buy that, I guess. So you're absolutely right that status quo bias is a deep feature of human psychology, a deep feature of human political groups, a deep feature of countries. I mean, it's a rock bottom fact of human existence. And I would add to that the American political system, in particular, today, is particularly status quo biased. There's so many choke points in our system of government where status quo interests can intervene and shut down attempts at change. And this, to me, was one of the most painful lessons of the climate bill fight is, you can have a majority of the country on your side, businesses, military, a majority of legislators in both houses of Congress and the president, all on your side, and you can still lose because ultimately, the ultimate choke point is you have to, if 40 U.S. senators can block anything. It doesn't matter what public opinion is, doesn't matter how big your majorities are. And 40 U.S. senators, especially, largely coming from rural states, low population states, fossil fuel heavy states, it's just, so status quo bias is intense in the U.S., even more so, I think, maybe than some other countries. But to me, your question presumes that to overcome status quo bias, that accuracy is an asset in that quest, and I'm just not sure it's so. I mean, the difficulty of overcoming status quo bias means that, to me, that you need an even more emotionally compelling case. You need a really gripping narrative if you want people to let go of what they have or embrace something different or embrace this theoretical future thing that they can't quite grab yet, you need a really compelling emotional case. And it just turns out to be difficult to at once to speak in compelling emotional languages that have good stories and good narratives, and also be, accurate and hedged and caveated to the point that you would satisfy sort of the standards of scientific dialogue. It seems to me those two are in tension with each other. And one final thing, you say if we make misstatements, the other side is going to grab onto them, dispute them, and then it will just look like a he said, she said dispute to the public, and they'll tune out. Everything's right about that, except for the need for us to say something inaccurate to start that process. Yeah. As I think we've seen, I was arguing about this with someone the other day on Twitter. They say, they were saying, don't you think the sort of inadequate hedges in the IPCC Part 4, subsection 3 on hurricanes did damage? And I said, no, the argument against the IPCC that did damage is world government socialism, which has nothing to do with accuracy and has nothing to do with any misstatement on the IPCC's part. So my point being, the people we're fighting against here don't give a damn about accuracy, and they don't give a damn about our accuracy. They give a damn about winning what they view as a political knife fight, and they don't need you to hand them weapons. They'll just ship you with whatever's laying around. So my point just being, how do you reconcile this need for strong emotions and strong narratives and compelling messages with what I think we both acknowledge is the not particularly compelling language of science and probability ranges and all the rest?
I guess, for me, the need to be correct about the science is what it is. It's just the way I approach issues. I've tried really hard, and when I make a mistake, whether there was a really significant mistake in a story I did identifying misdeeds of the American Petroleum Institute, and that was horrific, and it really undercut what was still a very powerful story. So and that wasn't about the science. It was about how much disinformation they were putting out in the mid to late 90s. So I just, as a journalist, approaching this through all this time as a journalist, I just am really averse to. I'm really about staying within the lines and not being selective.
You know that there's a lot of room between true and false, right? I mean, there's a lot of room between accurate and inaccurate. There's a difference between maybe inadequately hedging or exaggerating or just passing over some fine details and lying. There's a difference.
Well, yeah, but and I think looking back at An Inconvenient Truth, when I first wrote about the film, I described it as a lawyerly polemic. I mean, it was not a journalistic documentary. It was a documentary with an outcome envisioned,
mm-hmm.
and that's fine. He's an activist. I would never make the same film the same way. And in the end, when you look at the way the sloshing of the public pan on climate has settled out since then, there's very little evidence that it had a big influence beyond stimulating and motivating people who already cared about global warming to be more concerned about it. You look now at the sociological polling, and there's not that much difference. This issue is not more salient than it was 4 or 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or even 15, 20 years ago. And so what I do when in terms of my own personal concerns about the state of the planet and how we head toward roughly 9 billion people seeking decent lives with the fewest regrets, and what I've learned about the 6 Americas, which is that great study from Tony Lesarowitz and Ed Maybach at Yale. Anyone who wants to find out about it, just Google the phrase 6 Americas. And the bubbles at the end, it's like basically a little distribution of how people think about this issue. And there's a pocket of alarms over here and a pocket of dismissives over on the other end, and they're mm-hmm. very durable. Both of those types are utterly durable, small parts of our discourse. And they've been dominating the discourse on issues because go to any blog or any talk show, and it's the people with the loudest and most passionate points of view who are the ones there. And what I do, and what I've decided and really focused on in the time in these recent years is whether it's going to work or not, building the case around what's durable and where you can get the most overlap in people's positions. And when you talk about energy and you say we don't have the energy menu we need to have a smooth ride in this century, and that's, actively accepted by a much broader range of people than those who worry about the symptom of our energy insufficiency, which is global warming, then you say this is the place to focus. And
okay, let me.
And I know that that's kind of saying, well, you're skirting the real issue, but I don't know. I just think it's the place to focus.
Well, let me segue to one last issue then, because I did want to bring this up. I wrote a blog post about this the other day too. I know it's sort of a cliche. I think a cliche, as far as I know, invented by New York Times columnist Tom Friedman to turn to cab drivers to be stand-ins for the great unwashed masses. But nonetheless, I was in fact in a cab in New York on the way to the airport in New York City after our conference, and I was talking to the cab driver, this big burly guy named Steve, this interesting guy, very sort of archetypal loudmouth New Yorker. And we asked him about climate change, just because he seemed like such a sort of iconic, normal dude. Yeah. And we asked him about climate change. He sort of started talking, and he was worried that we were going to be zealous, and he kept sort of glancing at us to make sure we weren't going to start haranguing him. But once we just let him talk, he just started going on and on. And his attitude, I think, getting back to the Six Americas, his attitude, I think, is indicative of a very big chunk right in the middle of that curve. A distribution curve, which is that he's sort of skeptical about climate, not because of any one sort of knockdown fact, or not because he's worried about UN world government or whatever. He clearly wasn't an ideologue. He was obviously a conservative, but not an ideologue. He's just sort of generally skeptical because he kind of heard this and that about, didn't they used to worry about global cooling and right. Aren't there sunspots, and just sort of the vague fragments of information that had drifted across his plate. Clearly, he had been, I think he will probably watch his Fox News and the rest. And and it's not that he was particularly invested in any one of those theories, but he's just like, if there's just so much contradictory stuff out there, there just must be something fishy about it. And that I think is, I think is sort of general skepticism shared by many, many people. And so we were asking him, well, what would help you sort of come to terms with this, decide one way or the other? What would help you sort of settle this? And he said over and over again, I just want somebody to give it to me straight. He's like, no agendas. I don't want Al Gore's emotional this and that. I don't want a bunch of, I don't want Exxon telling me what to think. I just want somebody who's just going to tell me straight, no agenda, no BS. What do we know and not know? Right. And I think there's a real craving out there among that segment of the population, a real craving to just have it clearly laid out what we do and don't know, without all the emotional and ideological baggage. So I was thinking about this, my cab driver Steve, as I read this story in the New York Times the other day about this science hearing that the House held. It was at the request of Democrats. It was. Before we launch into blocking the EPA's ability to deal with global warming, let's talk one last time about the science of global warming. And the piece in the New York Times covering this hearing was just a classic example of, the scientists the Democrats invited said X, Y, and Z, and then the scientists that the Republicans invited said no, X, Y, and Z. And then, Inslee had a zinger, and Barton had a zinger, and, and then that's it. And that was the end of the story. And I just sort of was imagining Steve reading this thinking, well, damn it, who's right? Tell me what we know. Which of these scientists are credible? Which of these statements are backed by evidence? I want to know, don't just tell me what they said. Tell me who's right. And it just seems to me that there's a long way for journalism to go. It would be easy for journalism to just say a few simple things that are widely agreed upon by the scientific community without going into any sort of activist or, without being activist. Yeah. They could just say what's true, what we know to be true. And that, I'm frustrated that we're still in that place in journalism.
Well, it's there's a whole nother blogging heads thing to do on the media and climate specifically. And we might have even done it once. I did two. I've written 2 book chapters on this issue. If anyone really wants to dive in, just Google for front page thought and Revkin, and you'll find a bunch of stuff I wrote about the perils of how the media approach this issue. One of the biggest problems in media coverage is conflation of policy and science stories. And a hearing is poisonous because it is implicitly Republican and Democratic science. And in this arena, you will always be able to find, without relying on people who are lying or whatever, a selection of papers or whatever that have passed peer review and that have some credibility that can make whichever point you are in the political realm want to make. And that's the worst possible. So a hearing itself is the worst possible place to adjudicate these kinds of issues. And it really is a mistake to have science hearings, frankly. I think it's not, you need them to some extent just to articulate and enshrine what's known. But at the same time, Congress can also go to the national academies and just order up a report and then have the report reviewed. And I just think
they've done that a million times too, haven't they? I mean,
yeah, and again, in the policy realm, this is again, and I'll bring up, speaking of unmentioned, of Roger Pilkey Jr., who is considered he who shall not be named by a lot of activists in this realm, including some scientists. On political science, he quotes Walter Lippmann, and he says, politics is about getting people who think differently to act the same on something, and not about getting everyone to agree on something. And that relates to what we were saying earlier about energy versus climate. I think the reality of our political process is the only way forward, really, on issues that matter for climate is to focus on energy or innovation or, I hate to say it, chunky, Obama's discussion of a chunky policy. Again, there's no way to go backwards and look to see if there was another way to have a comprehensive bill. But going forward, looking for chunks that make sense to a lot of people for different reasons is probably the way to go.
But this presumes, and this is what I also think is a mistake made by good people for good reasons, but a mistake nonetheless, which is to presume that what you have going on in politics is 2 people with sort of sincerely opposed, or 2 parties with sincerely opposed beliefs that will do those things and adopt those policies that advance their beliefs. But that's not
the system is. The system right now
is a party that wants to knife. We have a party that wants to knife the president. They want to beat the president. So that by definition excludes doing the sort of cooperative meet in the middle things, which is what we saw the first 2 years.
I did do that. I did do a piece. When was it? A year or 2 ago, musing on whether there can only really be meaningful action on energy and in a secondary way on climate under a Republican president. Just when you look at how it all works, that may be the only. I didn't propose it, I didn't push it, but I said, in a realistic sense, that may be what it will take. Because then.
But that's because Democrats will cooperate to advance their policy goals, and Republicans won't. And if we can't, we just can't acknowledge that basic fact that one party has gone crazy, and one party has rejected empirical fact and rejected science and is purely ideologically devoted to defeating the other side by any means necessary. We can't have good prescriptions if we don't have the basic understanding of the layout of current politics. And, one of the sociological findings that comes up again and again is that, the vast bulk of the population don't have the time or cognitive attention or energy to dig into most issues.
No.
So they have these heuristics, these sort of shortcuts they take to get a grasp on issues. And one of those heuristics is, if it's controversial, there must be something fishy about it. And if it's accepted across parties, it must be a valid idea. But sort of once a political party understands that sociological finding, they will discover, all we need to do to make this thing look controversial is controvert it. And boom, the damage is done. So they're controverting basic science. They're controverting Mitt Romney's healthcare plan. They're controverting, George Bush 1's cap and trade plan. They just realize that if we just argue about everything, then everything looks suspicious. Everything looks grim and ugly. Politics looks ugly. People turn off. They tune out. And that's when status quo interests win the most, is when everybody's turned off and tuned out. So some way or another, we have to grapple with what politics has become and find a way past that, because it's not just on the planet. I mean,
I know. By the way, which means this means there's two things that we started with that are really important. One being focusing on adaptation, because don't expect Congress to solve, because to really be meaningfully engaged on this. And the other is bottom-up action, whether it's college campuses, whether it's finding ways to foster this country's innovative capacity. And again, one other thing I push on hard, and I think increasingly can be done in a sort of peer-to-peer way, is fostering basic skills that will be needed, basic sets of understanding and skills will be needed for us to be agile and resilient and to pull together when signals synchronize. I'll give you one quick example of how signals that were not synchronous might have played out differently, and I'm not wishing for any of this, but if I hadn't posted on this, but suppose the oil spill had come not when it did, but a year or so earlier when gas prices were $4 a gallon. If you had
Obama had declared he wanted offshore drilling.
Yeah, well, but if you had the this sort of clear and present economic signal, and even though they're not related, and the oil flowing in the Gulf, the dynamic would have been different. So I think what I'm talking about is sort of agility, readiness, a basic skill set, people engaged on the understanding that science matters and engineering capacity, and that thinking about acting on the future actually matters. Investing matters. Making the case against statists. I think there's I think a presidential candidate could make a pretty solid case right now against these 20th century statists who just want to who are so comfortable with making you think that everything's going to be fine. But I think most people now understand things are not going to be fine economically or environmentally. We're headed for some real crunch moments. And
people are uncomfortable. They know things are going wrong, but the problem is in the absence of a sort of compelling narrative about the future, what discomfort leads to is this sort of regressive flailing towards an imagined past, which is what the Tea Party is. Well, to end on a note of optimism, then I'll just say that these sort of bottom-up strategies you're talking about, which is sort of non-hierarchical, sort of peer-to-peer knowledge sharing and training each other and forming these kind of these opportunistic groups and strategies, all that stuff I think comes much more easily to young people than it does to old people, particularly young people who have grown up immersed in the internet, which really is a model of kind of peer-to-peer, spontaneous organization. So, if we can just keep the old people from destroying things for a few more years, I think we'll be in much better hands.
Yeah, that's why I write about what I call Generation E regularly, and it's not just E environment, it's not even just E energy, it's E enterprise, E education, and E equity. People focusing a little bit of their attention as they build a career or their own education on those things, along with making a life and having your family secure and safe and all that. Right. I think the odds are we can find a pretty decent path forward.
All right, so we've concluded then that children are our future. That's the kind of hard.
There you go. Boy, does that sound
hard-hitting news. Okay, well, thanks, Andy, and have a good one.
Same to you.
Bye now.